Good morning. I'm James Sparrow, Master of the Social Sciences Collegiate Division at the University of Chicago. On behalf of the college, it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's roundtable on free expression on campus. This event is sponsored by the college's Parrhesia Program, which is dedicated to fostering robust public discourse on campus, and by the Democracy Curriculum, an initiative to bring democratic questions back into the center of undergraduate studies and campus life. Our topic today is an essential one for anyone committed to the life of the mind. That is because free inquiry is the lifeblood of the university, and it is virtually impossible without the open-ended play of ideas and opinions to pursue free inquiry. The growth of new knowledge and of deep understanding quite literally depend upon free inquiry, and both are keys to the flourishing of everyone in our society, whether or not they engage in scholarship. Serious-minded, sustained disagreement remains the best way to surface the most robust ideas and to disarm the most pernicious ones. That genuine intellectual exchange, in turn, relies upon norms of constructive contentiousness, respectful disagreement, and a fair-minded approach to unwelcome evidence and argument. Serious inquiry, deliberation, reflection, and analysis are simply not possible in cynical combat mode. They're not merely performative gestures in the culture wars that are devouring our society. Rather, free inquiry is a collaborative, if often agonistic, enterprise whose standards we must defend fiercely and with stark honesty and open, probing debate. At the University of Chicago, we like to think that we have the home court advantage when it comes to talking about freedom of academic inquiry and expression. We've long prided ourselves on the contrarian virtues that have become central to our brand. But of course, these are commitments whose maintenance we share in common cause with our colleagues at peer institutions. Our guests today represent some very prominent exponents of robust academic inquiry. They're seasoned scholars and senior statesmen and women of higher education. They can provide us with unparalleled perspective and insight into the high stakes of free expression, not only for the continued vitality of academic inquiry, but for the very survival of our democratic public life. I know we'll all benefit from the insights that they have to share. And with that, I hand you over to our moderator, Layla Brammer, who's the director of our Parrhesia Program.
Thank you, Jim. I'm Layla Brammer. I'm a Director of Parrhesia Program for Public Discourse in the college at the University of Chicago. The program seeks to foster vigorous, inclusive, and productive campus and community discourse. When I'm off giving presentations to prospective students or students on campus or community members, the issue between perceived tension between diversity and notions of free expression often gets raised in those conversations. I am thrilled to be here today with some of the people who are on the front lines. They're also thought leaders and thinking about how students and others navigate those pressures on campus. I want to get right into the conversation. I've asked each person to introduce themselves and share a little bit about the few concerns or things they're excited about with free expression on campus. And then we're going to turn to the discussion. For those of you that have questions, if you put the questions in the chat, hopefully we'll get to as many as we can before the end of the program. We're going to start, President Decatur, with you.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation to join in this discussion today. I'd maybe start with one observation that I think is a moment of excitement or promise looking ahead, and that is that so whenever I open my email inbox, I find evidence of discourse and rigorous disagreement as being alive and well, at least on our campus, and our students are very willing to voice their opinions and to engage in real close examination, not only of big ideas, but then ideas, taking those ideas close to their own lives on campus. And I do think there's a spirit of that that's alive and well. My area of concern would be that, and it's I often see some of the challenges around free expression connected to similar challenges we see elsewhere about the desire or the ability of students to take risks, to put themselves out there, open to criticism, that there's something, a core piece of engaging in open discourse is being willing to put yourself on the line and take the risk of opening yourself up to criticism, opening your ideas up to criticism. And the tendency to hold back and to be a bit risk averse on that front is something that I see in students in a number of contexts, and I think that it has a big impact on free expression.
Thanks for that, President Decatur. Vice President Goff-Cruz, you're next.
Thank you. First of all, I want to say I'm really thrilled to be on this panel, but also to be thrilled to be back at the University of Chicago, even if it's virtual. Because my previous job was to be the vice president for University Life for several years before coming back to Yale for my current job, which is to be vice president for University Life at Yale and secretary. And in that job that I'm doing, it's a job where I am very focused on the student experience for all of our students, for the graduates, the graduate students, undergraduates, and the professional students. And I'm focusing on policies and procedures, including those that impact free expression. And lately, I've also been working on Belonging at Yale, an initiative that's focused on inclusivity. I think from that vantage point of doing both the work of students, thinking about the student experience and thinking about inclusivity overall for the entire university, from that vantage point, I would say that I'm very interested in and excited about exploring the interdependence between freedom of expression and inclusivity. And that's what we're doing right now through the Belonging at Yale initiative. We can talk a little bit more, Layla, about that in the question and answer session, but I would say that's mostly what we're focusing on. And the question we're being asked by students is, how do you have these conversations? Not just the risk that President Decatur talked about, but how do you actually have them? And that's really what we're building into the program for Belonging at Yale, because that we think is really important for inclusivity to thrive and freedom of expression to thrive on this campus.
Excellent, thanks for that. Vice President Rasmussen.
Well, thank you so much, Leila. It's great to be here. And just point of clarification, I'm not actually a vice president. I'm a dean of students at the university, but I do function like a vice president of student affairs. So just for that slight clarification there. I'm going to be a little bit more, I think, optimistic, which is often unusual for someone in my role. But I think one of the great opportunities we have in this work and in this space is the fact that every year we welcome an entirely new group of students, undergraduates, graduate, and professional students. And at schools like UChicago and schools like the ones represented here today, those students come from an incredible array of backgrounds and experiences. Some may come from countries where the concept of free speech or hate speech or free expression is entirely different from what we have here in the United States. And I see that as a tremendous opportunity and a tremendous responsibility that we really need to do a good job and a continual job in inculcating our values around free expression to our students, and not assume that just by virtue of stepping foot on our campuses, they're going to magically know why these values are important, particularly why they're important to scholarship and research and being part of a civic society. And so I see that refreshing of our student body every year as a reminder of the importance that we have as officers of the university, as student life leaders and stewards of the student experience, to make sure that we are developing programs, education, opportunities baked into the student experience that reinforce the importance of these values. And I'll just add too that I think for a number of years, several of us were worried that students were taking for granted why free expression was so integral, particularly to protest and demonstration and activism. And while the last year in particular has been very traumatic for many of our students and many of our fellow citizens in the United States, I also think it's demonstrated very powerfully to students why free expression is so important. Why the ability to speak out against government, why the ability to speak out against institutions that you feel are wrong is so integrally important to what they need to be as citizens and residents of this country. And we play a powerful role in helping to encourage that.
Thank you. President Roth.
Hi, I'm glad to be here as well. I've been president at Wesleyan since 2007. And I see some of the risk-averse characteristics that Sean mentioned in regard to speech, not in regard to lots of other risks, alas. And part of the job of an effective teacher is to help students overcome that. I guess I'm teaching a course now where we just finished a unit on how to represent rape. Early in the semester, we had a unit on grace, forgiveness, and salvation. This week, we're reading conservative authors on guilt and political correctness. My students seem to have no trouble, little trouble, being able to argue about a wide range of ideas, but nonetheless, they are, and I think rightly, deeply suspicious of the ideology of free speech that has become part of the brand of certain institutions, as Dean put it before, and is being used right now to squash democracy in the United States. The Supreme Court will hear a case, I take it soon, about saying that we shouldn't have to disclose the donors to not-for-profit organizations because that's a violation of free speech. We will have work unions busted because they are violators of free speech. Free speech has been weaponized by the right in order to destroy democracy. And we at the university, I think, can be complicit in that process when we defend naively free speech to students who understand that power matters in speech, and it's not just about procedures.
Professor Stone.
I'm Jeff Stone. I've been on the faculty here since 1973, served as dean of the law school and provost of the university, and I chaired the committee that wrote the university's free expression principles. When I think about what's happened in recent years, I think probably the most important change has to do with what in the First Amendment jurisprudence we talk about as chilling effect. That is, one of the realities about free speech is that for me to decide to hand out a petition or to make a speech or to donate money to a particular cause or to make a certain argument will have very little positive impact on the world. And yet, as a consequence of that, if I feel that I will be subjected to serious disadvantage for doing that, I will be chilled in my willingness to do so. And largely because of social media, I think, what's happened in recent years is the penalty that individual faculty members and students can be forced to pay for offending others is wildly greater than anyone would have imagined 10 or 20 years ago. And therefore, the reluctance to say things that will upset or annoy others has become extremely powerful. And that, I think, is a grave danger to a system of academic freedom and a freedom of speech. And it poses a huge challenge to universities and colleges, as well as to the nation, in terms of how to address that in a persuasive and sensible way. And it's not obvious how one does it. To Michael's point about campaign finance and the like, just quickly, I mean, I agree with him. Free speech is not an absolute good across the boards. There are principled and appropriate limits to it. And many justices of the Supreme Court, for example, have held that campaign finance laws are constitutional. Congress has enacted legislation limiting campaign expenditures. But we have a group of justices on the Supreme Court today who are much more political than principled. And I think that is another factor that has distorted the understanding of free speech.
Thank you, Jeff. And my guess is we could spend all afternoon talking about that particular issue as well. Jeff, I want to put on hold the chilling effect thing, because I think that's something that's a larger issue that we want to come back to. I want to lay out some of those principles here. I'm sure when you're out giving presentations on this, you often get asked about what is a perceived tension between diversity and inclusion and free expression. How do you answer that?
I think that it is true that there are points of view that some people have that they sincerely hold that are offensive and hurtful to others. And I think I have, I guess, two responses to this. One is that it is important to make arguments and state positions that one believes to be true in order to have a debate about issues that matter, and not to be chilled or intimidated into silence, because it is critical that we address real issues, however we wind up resolving them. Second, however, I think it's important, as the Chicago principles state, that academic institutions should value civility and mutual respect, and that we therefore should infuse in our students an understanding of both the necessity to speak openly and truthfully and candidly about their views, but also to understand that they should express those views in ways that are effective and not needlessly offensive, hurtful, and divisive. And I think both of those values can be supported and need to be supported.
Professor Stone, what do you say when people say that, you know, that's all well and good, but there's an entry price to that discourse, right? That it might not be a level space that everybody can enter into and engage in that type of discourse, particularly if something hateful has been said about them.
Well, the problem is that we live in a world and in a society in which there are certain groups and individuals and activities that are the target of more condemnation than other groups and individuals and activities. A woman who has an abortion, a gay person, less today than 20, 30 years ago. Obviously, racial minorities. And also on the other side, there are Trump supporters who are targeted as people who are idiots and evil. But so I think that's just built into the system of free expression. There are going to be groups and positions and beliefs that are going to be condemned by others. And that makes it not as fair a system as you would like, but policing the fairness, in my judgment, does more harm than good. And that it's essential for the institution to make clear to its participants that it is important to do these things in a way that is civil and that shows mutual respect, but to recognize that on certain issues, certain people will suffer more upset and condemnation than others. But that's just part of life. And we have to support those people. And we have, as an institution, we have to find ways to support them. But you don't support them by silencing critics.
President Decatur, you've spent a lot of time talking about that civil space on college campuses. Do you have something that you'd like to say in relationship to that call that Professor Stone has made?
And I think I agree with the fundamental core of what Professor Stone has laid out, but maybe with the one caveat that the definitions of civility and mutual respect aren't fixed in time. They actually change over time. When I think about my own campus here at Kenyon, you can go back and read the student handbook from 60, 70 years ago, remarkably restrictive in terms of speech on campus, because the definitions of what would have been considered civil behavior at that time probably exclude not only many of the people who are here on campus, but actually also much of the activity that a student in 2021 might engage in would be shocking to someone in several generations ago. And that evolution of what's considered civil, what's considered mutual respect, is the place where judgments are made and judgments change over time. And that's the place where a lot of the friction between what one might accuse of being politically correct standards or policing on campus really come into conflict with the notion of to be civil means, to be civil in an inclusive environment actually means defining civility in such a way that includes all of the members of the community. And that's where that's actually where the hard work of campus actually happens, right? How do you balance, or how do you make everyone invested in that concept of civility and mutual respect in the context of our moment?
And Professor Decatur, I know that you have to jump off in just a few minutes, but I want to get you back in the conversation after I turn this to President Roth. You have some, I was reading your views about civility, and they're much more in line with my views. It's a word I try not to use because it has been used so often to silence people from the outside. Do you have something you'd like to respond on this?
Well, I think that, as Sean said, the hard work happens in these smaller spaces that rather than I think about deep disagreements about the principles. I think when especially folks in our generation appeal to these principles, the aroma of hypocrisy is perhaps we're like those COVID people, we can't smell it, but the students just, they feel it intensely, that somehow the principles are a cover for the continued oppression or marginalization and disrespect for people who have long been marginalized and disrespected. And I don't think that's necessarily true, actually. I think that as Professor Stone has pointed out time and time again, over a long period of time, these principles have been used to counteract precisely the oppression and marginalization. However, in the last generation, they have been appropriated by others, and our students know that, and they, especially those who are new to the university environment, feel that these principles play to the advantage of the advantaged. and I think they're often right. And so I don't think universities have ever actually prospered through a devotion to what was the phrase used? Was it uncontrolled inquiry or free? It's always been controlled inquiry. And so our job is to offer guide rails to help more people participate in productive conversations. And sometimes that will look less like free speech than at other times. It's about curating an environment in which more people can offer more ideas. When I was a student, it might have seemed to us like white guys that we were contested, we were battling about ideas because we just didn't get to hear ideas from women, from Black people, from many people. And so we thought we were like deep into free inquiry because it was so controlled for us by segregation and economic relations. And so I think that there's a lot more in some respect from students, diversity of opinion. I do worry that faculty diversity of opinion is thin at times. And at my institution, I have an ongoing discussion with my faculty about the value of intellectual diversity and how we have to not depend on free speech as a market principle to allow for intellectual diversity. We have to actually curate intellectual diversity as best we can, knowing that we could also screw it up. And Professor Stone said before, you could do more harm than good. I think that's true. We have to be careful about it, but I don't think we could ignore our obligation to try to find ways to include more ideas and more people in the conversation.
One of the pieces that I want to pick up is the differences between campus spaces. It seems we're talking about maybe the classroom, but there are these differences between the classroom, the quad, maybe residential halls and social media. President Decatur, I'm going to give it to you since you have to leave in a few minutes. You get how to negotiate those differences that might exist within spaces. Maybe they don't.
I think they do, and they do in part. I sort of return to this notion of the closer you get to the personal, the harder it is to navigate these things. So as Michael was saying, sometimes in the classroom, actually, especially in the classroom when you're dealing in debate on ideas on an abstract level, you can get really rigorous and intense debate happening, and folks who feel pretty fearless in digging in on a position or in sort of engaging in a position that might be very different than their own. What gets difficult is when your roommate has a set of issues that are fundamentally, or expressing a set of ideas that may be fundamentally different, and that you may find, if not hurtful, at least outside of the way you as an individual define sort of your own norms or your own set of values. And it's those value conflicts at that level when I think we see the most chilling of speech, right? Because now it's not speech that's happening at an abstract level, it's speech that's happening really close to home. And as Professor Stone was saying, I think one of the things that social media introduces into this that changes the dynamic, like I think this is an age-old dynamic, but in social media blurs some of those boundaries between what's close and personal and what is at a distance, right? And it gets harder to tell the difference between the personal and the distant. And so when things that happen in the classroom might actually show up on a Facebook page, or and that goes to show how out of touch I am with social media, and that I'm certain that none of our students would actually put something on a Facebook page, but on whatever the equivalent of a Facebook page is now. That's a place where you begin to get a blurring of those distinctions and a broadening of that chilling effect. And so, I think things get harder the closer they get to personal, and then social media blurs the boundaries in ways that begins to make everything chilled to some degree.
Dean Rasmussen, I'm going to tag you in here because you're on the front lines of navigating those issues. How do you talk to students about that? You say we need to articulate better the principles. So how do you do that in those different spaces and have them understand what they mean on the ground?
Yeah, it's definitely a very complex landscape for students, especially those students who are residential, because I do agree. And I remember actually meeting with Jeff and the committee on free expression about this very topic, about expectations when you're in your residential space around the kind of environment that you should be expected to tolerate versus if you're walking across the quad and you see a flyer on a bulletin board that really upsets you for whatever reason based on its content, right? The question becomes, should we have a different set of standards as to what can be posted on a residence hall bulletin board that you have to walk by every day because that's your home, versus what you should be prepared to accept or just tolerate even in more public spaces. So this idea of the private sphere versus the public sphere, I think very definitely plays out on a campus. I think social media, just as an observation, has made it even more difficult sometimes for those of us who are working with students to understand or parse out what is a deeply personal space where you should feel that you are not a university student, you're just expressing yourself in a personal space, versus something that you might utter in a common room or in a classroom where others who are part of the campus community have to hear it. They don't have to be your friend on or your privy to your postings on social media. That is not a requirement of being a student. I think it's really challenging sometimes for students who feel deeply aggrieved by what they are hearing, what they are seeing, to help them understand that just because it doesn't rise to a policy violation doesn't mean that their experience isn't legitimate. And I think that the vast majority, and I would say 80 to 90% of the conversations we have with students who are upset by some form of expression is helping them understand that it's not a policy violation, but here's what we can do to help you grapple with this. whether it be have a conversation with the person who upset you, whether it be to seek out some other support services, whether it be just to step away from whatever the environment is that's creating this space that's upsetting you. And it can be emotionally draining, I think, for the student, because they feel, and I think this gets back to some earlier points, they feel sometimes that their upset is not being legitimately understood or appreciated. And I think that's where some of the tension with the administration will often play out for those of us who work with students, is they feel that they're not being heard or respected. But if we're not in the business of monitoring social media, we're not in the business of seeking out, offensive, comments that are made, on the fly, because if we did that, then, first of all, we simply don't have enough hours in the day to do that. But it also, again, flies in the sense of, we're not here to be speech police. We're here to help you understand how you navigate a world where you're going to have to hear opinions that are really distasteful to you. It's tough. I wish we had, we have endless conversations in my circles, both at UChicago and elsewhere, about how, in fact, you help students get through this. And I'll say too, just before I end, that this isn't limited to undergraduates. I would say at UChicago, a lot of our conversations around particularly social media posts that are really upsetting to entire cohorts of students are often happening in graduate and professional programs.
Thanks, Michelle. Vice President Goff-Cruz, you talked about the Belonging at Yale initiative, and particularly focusing on something that's near and dear to my heart that often doesn't get a lot of attention when we're talking about free speech, is how do we have these conversations? We often throw students and we expect that they know how to swim because they can talk, but talking isn't communication. So how do you help them learn to have the conversations about with and across differences?
Well, we start in the classroom. So we start with actually supporting faculty. We have a Poorvu Center for Teaching and Learning, and we start by supporting faculty and trying to create inclusive environments for conversation with students about difficult conversations. And so we do a lot of that work. We also do specific coaching. That's the kind of thing that Michelle mentioned in terms of talking to students directly about, here's how you have these conversations, kind of coaching them through the process. Spending a lot of time with student organizations, particularly student leaders, because a lot of those conversations not only happen in the residence halls, but also happen in student organizations. So how do you actually lead those conversations, or part of the conversations we will have with students? We also spend time modeling the behavior that we actually want to have students, with the faculty talking to each other. We try to make sure that, that's front and center of what the students will see. The speakers that people bring to campus, one of the things we've been actually focusing on is trying to really encourage having multiple speakers on a topic who have very different viewpoints, so students can actually see that conversation in action. And that can be difficult because the cost of bringing multiple speakers to campus can be difficult. So we're trying to figure out how to make that more of a commonality. And then when there is an issue externally or on campus, part of what we've been doing is trying to provide educational resources, not just the resources to address the hurt, which is what we always do in these conversations, but also articles you might want to read that have different viewpoints about the topic, so that we are educating people, or having people understand that the first thing you want to do is actually understand the issue. So we're starting to really try to dig down there as well. So we're trying a lot of different things to make sure that we are giving students an option of how to have the conversation, which is what they've asked us to do. And the other thing I would say, which I find so fascinating in terms of this Belonging at Yale work, is that when we have the conversation and we've listed our goal is really to be able to support students in figuring out how to do this, we heard from faculty and staff and alumni that they too wanted to be able to have the ability to have this conversation. I think it's something Michelle mentioned, that sometimes you actually see this with some of the older students, but we also see it with the adults. And for our position is that we want to make sure that that's possible, that we provide resources for people to do that elsewhere, not just students, because we want the whole community to be one where people see each other having really good conversations, difficult conversations in a variety of ways. And that's really important for the whole community to see, and it will affect students as well.
Excellent. Before we move on, President Decatur, do you have any final words that you would like to share before we let you go?
Just one thing that, and it's an observation, but it connects to the ways in which the speech within a community gets broadened, through media very quickly. A long-term concern I have actually is with newspapers on campus, and some of that is that the newspapers now campus newspapers are open to the universe, which is great and terrific. That also opens them up to be trolled and exploited in media on all sides. So there's a real chilling effect that happens when you have a student writing an opinion piece that's intended for the campus that all of a sudden ends up on a blog site on its way to Fox News or some other trajectory there. That I think is it's one of these things I think we really just need to grapple with in terms of how the exploitation of speech on campus actually can lead to a chilling effect on the type of speech that happens.
Oh, that's an excellent point, particularly as students are, of an age of 18 to 22 for many of us in the undergraduate realm, and they're testing out new things and trying new things, and yet the social media and other things blow those up into public conversations that maybe they're not ready and prepared to have or intending to have as far as consequences. President Roth, I'd like to turn to you. You've published a book called Safe Enough Spaces. It's an interesting concept. Do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. Just in regard to what Sean was saying just now, we for years, even before social media, ex-student reporters for the newspaper would write and say, can you erase this byline I had? I'm applying for a job and I had a sex column in this paper, or I said these things about you, President Roth, and of course I didn't really mean them, and some of it's social, some of it does actually, the big spotlight, that's the thing. It's more speech, right? I mean, the solution is supposed to be more speech. Well, Fox News is a lot more speech, but sometimes more speech for people who aren't prepared for it is really detrimental. And I do think that our campuses these days are one of the few places where you are likely to have less polarized or less curated, less segregated communities of conversation. Certainly in national politics, people kind of go with the information of their party, go with the information flow of their tribe, stick together in housing, stick together in their social affiliations. It's very unusual outside of a university to have a poor kid living next to a rich kid, and blacks and whites living next to each other. I mean, universities are much more alive to the conflict of ideas than I think any other space you could find in the country. I mean, I can't think of one. And so in Safe Enough Spaces, I argue that it's important for us to recognize that sometimes actual harm happens and that we need to protect students from harassment and intimidation, which was just part of the deal of going to school before. Part of the deal of being a woman graduate student when I was a graduate student in the 70s was that you expected professors to want to sleep with you and you had to deal with that. That was just a part of the deal. My friends, when I was an undergraduate, that was part of the deal. That was one of the ways you knew a professor cared about you. It's not, now we don't accept that as the price of admission for certain groups. So we reject intimidation and harassment. And so, but if we try to create too safe a space, it's the old psychoanalytic notion, if you try to be too good a parent, you make a psychotic child. And if you don't do anything as a parent, this child won't survive. So you need a good enough parent. So I argue in this book that you need a safe enough space. And I look at the transition from affirmative action to equity inclusion in the first section, which is and how hard it is to feel included if you also value critical thinking. I mean, if you learn in a class that you're an idiot, it's hard to feel included. But there are idiots in classes, and they need to learn that they're sometimes acting like idiots. But that makes equity and inclusion challenging if people are going to be wrong about something, and they are often wrong about something. I look at the history of political correctness and how it developed as a concept, and now it's the woke is the new political correctness, racialized version of political correctness, and how it's been weaponized. And then I look at intellectual diversity and argue for a very broad but not absolute version of free speech, rejecting the market-oriented free speech talk that is often associated with Chicago, because I think it ignores, just like the free market fundamentalists, it ignores that sometimes real harm happens, sometimes pollution happens. You just can't wait for the market to do its work. You'd have to intervene, very conscious of the fact that you could also make things worse. So interventions have to be done prudently. And one of the interventions I describe is trying to bring on full scholarship military veterans to campus who otherwise wouldn't be there, and to hire faculty whose views are not well represented by our faculty. They tell me, my beloved colleagues, that they hire the best people and they just happen to have the same views that the current people have. But that sounds to me like my generation when I was in school. The men said, well, we just wind up hiring men because they're just so good. And I think we have to intervene to try to create more intellectual diversity, not just diversity of identity. And so a diverse enough, a safe enough space.
I think, President Roth, you cross over into one of my main concerns about this, and Professor Stone talked about it at the beginning, is that chilling effect that we have. I see it as two tensions. We have first the tension of being able to talk about with and across differences, the actual ability to engage in those discussions and have them be productive and produce knowledge or understanding at the very least. And then we have the people who have backed away from that. And we have a few questions coming in that talk about that chilling effect of not wanting to engage because you don't want something on record. How do we deal with that on university campuses? How do we ensure that we do have this viewpoint diversity?
I think that, as others have said, I think so much depends on what part of the university you're talking about. So in the classroom, it's a good old-fashioned thing. Like, some people just aren't going to raise their hand because the penalty of looking like an idiot seems great. And so I cold call on people and they hate it. And I don't, I try to make it work for them as a group, and that's part of the job. That's the job. It's not, but when it works, you see people just accelerating their ability to take a risk, because actually the penalty isn't that high, because we all are comrades or friends in that classroom. Now, with social media, as Jeff and others have said, the risk seems greater, but it's also in some odd way, it's quite transitory. The person who was vilified yesterday may not be vilified or not be vilified by the same people tomorrow. And so I think helping students be braver about their ability to tolerate discontent, and stronger in their ability to reject insult. That's part of not just the university, but part of growing up. Their alternative, and this is what many people choose, is to say, I'm just going to stay away from those people. I'm just not going to talk to people who might actually act that way. And it's very tempting. It's very tempting. I mean, I'm forgetting her name, a political theorist, just wrote a book on civility. She was heard it recently giving a talk, and she talked about the pleasures of homology, the word she used. And disagreement is displeasuring for many people. And to give people a sense of the pleasures of discord, the pleasures of risk, and helping them develop a thicker skin, I think is a part of our job. On a residential campus, you have an advantage that you can try to create an atmosphere of collegiality, of loyalty, where people, even when they get angry at each other, there's something that connects them. But absent that, because and that is absent on social media, it's a challenge. But I think we have to encourage bravery. We're not going to get rid of the penalties, I don't think. I think we just have to increase our ability to tolerate those penalties.
So how do we encourage bravery if that's what it takes? Professor Stone, I've heard you talk about bravery before, or courage.
I think it's one of the things you have to explicitly talk to students about. I think that, you know, when I teach, for example, like Michael, I teach cold calling Socratically. I almost never seek to persuade the students of any particular point of view that is mine. What I try to do is to get them to articulate all different sides of equations, make the best arguments they can make on the different sides, and then leave it to them to figure out what they think. And I think that's the skill that education at its best instills in its students. I do want to say another word about the social media chilling effect issue, because I think part of the problem it creates is that in the past, if a student said something that was regarded as deeply offensive by some others, they would be pissed off, and then it would disappear. Today, they post it on social media, and anyone who wants to Google that student's name can then find that the student said that and did that. And that can come back and haunt them in all sorts of ways down the road, whether somebody will agree to your invitation to have a date, or whether someone will hire you, or whether someone will admit you to graduate school. And so I think students have become acutely aware of that. And that is, I think, a very powerful and unfortunate impact on students. The other side point I want to make, which I think is important to understand, is that the Chicago principles are 2.5 pages, right? I could teach, I'm teaching this quarter a course on freedom of speech and press. I could teach in half of the first class an overall summary of the First Amendment and the jurisprudence of the First Amendment. But then I spend the next 26.5 classes going through the endless permutations and combinations and complications that exist. And so when you ask the questions about the residence halls and the dining halls and all the rest of it, those are real complicated questions. They're not simple. You can start with a set of principles, but the principles do not automatically resolve the million other hypothetical or real world complications that arise. And that requires a lot of thought, a lot of subtlety, and a lot of analysis.
And a lot of work.
And a lot of work, absolutely, it does.
I always talk to my students about, you know, all of our civil liberties are held in that contestation piece. That's why we have a Supreme Court, right, is to work through those. Baked into free expression is literally that it will be contested, right? Because it is the expression of the thing that contests, right?
And every decision the Supreme Court makes opens the door to 50 more controversies.
Right. And then we add on the developing of technology, right? And
yes,
into jurisprudence keeping up with that. I want to turn to student policies on that, and Dean and Vice President, and how you know, what do we do about the chilling effect? Are there ways in which you can open it up in the student life area, as well as we might argue some of us are doing it in the classroom?
Well, I think it helps, actually, and I realize that I'm biased because I've been at UChicago for a number of years, but I do think it helps to not have a speech code and to not take everything to a disciplinary system, whatever that might be at your institution. I think that, just as I was saying before, that students can get frustrated and angry when the institution doesn't intervene when they feel that they have been wronged, or a group that they might be part of or that they advocate for has been wronged in their view by the expression of some thought or opinion. On the flip side of that, I think it actually can be reassuring to students to see that the university is not going to swoop down and kick them out or drag them through a disciplinary hearing for expressing a viewpoint that they believe in, or that they're just trying on as part of their development as young scholars, as intellectuals, whatever the case might be. And the key thing is to be utterly consistent in that. you know, one of the, just as an observer of higher ed over the last 20 years, you know, where you see schools get into trouble is when they start to be inconsistent, not only in their approach to different students who do the same thing, but if they have one set of expectations or policies written down in their student manual and yet they don't follow them, that is when you start to see a breakdown of trust, certainly of students of their institution. But I think it also sends, you know, a message to students that you better shut up if you don't want to get into trouble, which is not what we want. So I think that is really important. And, you know, while we do have a disciplinary system that addresses disruptive conduct, which can include students who choose to use expression to disrupt something that they don't agree with, we feel very strongly that that should not be allowed to happen. The number of times I've actually had to use that disciplinary system can be counted on one hand, and it's been around for 3 or 4 years now. So I think that's telling. I think that says that we don't just flippantly send anybody through this system, but I also like to think that it speaks to our ability to show students what they can and cannot do within the sphere of free expression and how their free expression should not and cannot impinge on that of others. Kim, I'd love to hear what you have to say on this.
Well, I definitely agree with Michelle. I definitely agree with you, having lived this both at Chicago and at Yale, that is what we do. I would say the other avenue we're choosing is to try to cultivate a culture of giving people the benefit of the doubt, because I think to the extent that you know that you're going to be received in a way that you're not going to be punished or vilified in any way, to the extent that we can have that as the standard response that we expect students to have when they're having difficulties, that has been helpful. So we're trying to do that as well. We're also sometimes talking to students about, if you're going to have a disagreement, again, how do you do that? We have rules around protests when you bring speakers to campus. How do you actually do that in a way that's really successful? Some of the best protests I've actually attended have been at the U Chicago, very creative in terms of the way they did that. But some of it is about, again, making sure that people feel that they're going to get the benefit of the doubt, and that they're going to get, again, some sense of how do you have these conversations? How do you do it well? And cultivating the courage in having them.
From the questions, there's another concern that's coming up that's, I think gets at Jeff's point about how difficult and the tensions that are there. But, you know, where do you draw the line between what is factually wrong and statements disguised as opinions and free speech? Now we've moved to misinformation or disinformation. Sorry, Jeff, you're muted.
Sorry. As a general matter, the university, like the government, should not be deciding what is true or what is false. It is very dangerous to give a government or even a university the power to make those decisions, particularly when we're talking about issues that are relative to public matters and disagreements along those lines. And therefore, I think that there are situations where there are false statements that can be legitimately punished, like fraud or defamation. But as a general matter, I don't think the university should be going around and punishing people for making statements that the university believes are inaccurate. Let individuals respond and correct it if they think the statement's wrong. If the statements actually cause serious harm in a very concrete way, as defamation might or fraud might, then the university, like the government, might be able to intervene. But as a general matter, we should not regard ourselves as the truth deciders as an institution. The whole point about having debate about questions includes not only ideas, but also facts.
The rest of you on the panel, do you have responses?
Well, as I'm sure everyone knows, it's even more complicated when the vilifiers use that as a way of protecting vilification as a form of speech and retreat to experiential statements rather than objective fact statements to say Professor X is a racist because he made all these people feel uncomfortable around race in that class. And you don't take it to Fox, you could take it to MSNBC, you could take, wherever you want, choose your poison. And the professor will come to me or to a dean and say, what are you going to do about this? This person is ruining my life. And I could say, well, that's free speech, buddy. Have some courage. But that's not adequate, right? So how do you figure out a way where you don't get to a point where the motivation sometimes it's motivation not based on maliciousness, right? So it makes the defamation argument harder. It's just a mistaken perception of someone's motivation. But they'll use free speech talk to protect them, or as even when it gets to be a threat. I mean, we had a case where someone made an overt threat on social media, and the fire people said it was, what do they call it? A performative, hyperbolic activist speech. And so they were wanting to defend this person. And I don't think actually the principles are going to help you there. I think you're in an area where both people will be claiming some kind of principled freedom, and the norms of behavior have broken down so that you just have to start to knit back your kind of community foundation before you're going to be able to keep those things from happening. As a rule, I agree with Jeff. You want to foster inquiry, not conclusions. My students get frustrated. They'll come after class and say, well, but what do you really think? And it's a mistake to tip your hand too much or at all, really, because you want them to really think, obviously. And that happens well, I think, when people have confidence in the system. Right now, there's so little confidence in our disciplinary systems at universities, in the judicial system in the country. And my students make very strong arguments about, lists of denunciation. It's a free country. They make a list to tell each other about some guy's behavior. I try to get them to report, so there's a process. And they say, your process has screwed over people for a long time. And I can't quite disagree with that. I want them to have faith in the future process. Until they do, I think it's an uphill battle.
If I will take the bait and push back just a little bit, because this is maybe one of those places where we have a difference in the classroom, because certainly in the classroom, we have places where facts matter, right? I can't write my piece in geology necessarily on the flat earth, right? That's something that's going to get the pushback and have that argument out. So it's not, I think there is a place in the classroom, there are some questions that aren't open, right, Jeff? There is a First Amendment, for example. It is real.
Yes. Well, as I said, you can state the principles of free speech in 2.5 pages, but the application of those principles can take 60,000 pages. And the classroom is different. Students have a right to get up in the quads within certain bounds and give speeches. They don't have a right to get up in the middle of a class in the classroom and give speeches. And so in the classroom setting is different from other contexts. And you can give somebody a bad grade because they made inaccurate statements in their answers on an exam. But you can't punish them for making the exact same inaccurate statements out in the quads if they're making an argument about politics or whatever. So yeah, as I said, the application of the principles changes depending upon the context in which the issue arises. But it's the core principles that are fundamental.
Vice President, we have Daniel wants to know more about creative protests. What's it look like to creatively use discourse to protest other discourse?
Creative protests, amazing signs. Some of the best signs I've seen have been at the University of Chicago. I think some of you will recognize them, and even at our own institution. I've seen protests. There was a protest on our campus where students were protesting something and they were talking about the amount of money it costs, so they dropped dollar bills in the protest, but then of course they picked them up because they didn't want the staff to have to clean up after them. So that was like a very interesting performative moment, Professor Roth. And so there's ways in which I believe students, when they're being really creative, can really not only speak in ways that are very passionate, but also protest in ways that are very creative. So those are some of the things that I've seen, which I just think are really kind of interesting, unique to Chicago, unique to Yale, and things that I actually encourage students to do.
Any other good examples out there of the ways in which we can use these expressive moments to speak truth to power?
When I was a college student at University of Pennsylvania, I was suspended for participating in a protest. A bunch of students, not including me, climbed up on an iron fence by a building, and the fence broke, and the top part of it, which had points on it, came falling down into my back. So I got taken to the hospital, and the next morning I got a phone call from the dean of students saying, "You've got to come to my office in an hour," and they suspended me like that. And it was the end of my first year, a week left of classes. And I said, "How long am I suspended?" And he said, "You're suspended until the fall." And I thought about it for a while. I said, "Screw this, I'm going to take my exams. Nobody's going to know." So I, in fact, went in, took my exams, did fine. Nobody ever found out that I did that. And then when I was applying to law school a couple of years later, I went to the next dean of students and told them the story, not about the exams, and asked if they could expunge it. And they said, "Sure." So, it's okay. I survived it.
We've had many. When I was interviewed for this job, the trustees at the time said, "Oh, it's a beautiful office," and it is a beautiful office. It's not a background. I said, "Oh, I know. I slept in it," and when I was a student. But to my payback was when I was president, a group of students came barging in, and I knew it. It's a small place. I know everybody, a lot of students, and some of them were my own students. I said, what are you doing? You can come in office hours. Why are you coming now? And this student takes something out of her pocket. It's the student newspaper from 1977. And she says, "These are the students who were disciplined," and my name was in the paper for occupying the office. And the students here, they can't disrupt. And so they surround me when I'm giving a speech. So it's hard to give a speech, but they don't prevent me from giving the speech. But I'll give you one other example. It was a tough one for me. The affirmative action bake sale, you may remember from a few years ago, was something engineered by the right around the country. But there was a group of students at Wesleyan who were selling cupcakes in the university center, and they were charging white people more than other people. And they had differentiation to make the point that it would be unfair, and affirmative action does that, and it's unfair. So I had a group of Black students come to see me and said, "This protest should be squashed. I should stop it, or at least write a denunciation of it." And I said I thought it was awful, and I felt they should go in there and argue with the people about it. But I felt it was political theater, and political theater, I still don't think I should censor. I think they should argue about it. I think they should vilify those folks, if you will, for using a racist protest. But I didn't think that my job was to stop the protest, the theater from happening, even though it was a unpopular position. So I think students will find ways to put pressure on people like me to pay attention to their demands, and I think I think it's appropriate.
It is. I started teaching over 30 years ago, and and I think it's also where I was teaching. I used to have to encourage students to take a stand or to protest. I'd often be like, "Protest something, me, I don't care, choose something." As President Decatur said earlier, that's really not necessarily the case anymore. There's a lot going on, and lots of conversation that is happening. I want to turn to an issue that's come up a couple times in the Q&A, and certainly is an issue that's out there. What do we do about some of the pressures of international pressures on freedom of expression that then have an impact on our students here on a U.S. campus? Michelle, you had talked about educating students when they come, but some students come with perhaps some international pieces that are also quelling their speech. And I'm not saying you have to take that, Michelle, but, you know, what do we do about that when, you know, universities may exist in the US, but they're certainly, especially on Zoom, extra US. How do we help students navigate that?
I think one of the things, you know, one of the things we have in our School of Management, we have a lot of international school students. And so one of the things that they're really focusing on is just talking about what does this mean to be in this country, getting an education in this country, and being very specific about the idea of a free expression and what that means in the classroom, but also in student activities. And I refer to them because they're also the group that actually focuses on creating a culture where people are given the benefit of the doubt, because there's so many people coming with different perspectives on what this means, what any issue, how to refer to any issue, that they couldn't function if they didn't have that as a core principle along with free expression in that school. And so we really sort of adopted that as a mantra we want for the rest of the university. So I think sometimes it's very important for schools, for our Office of International Affairs to talk to students, international students, about what some of the issues are, and then to explain when issues blow up in the United States, what are we actually talking about? What are the different positions that people are taking, so that they can, one, enter into the conversation with some degree of knowledge, but understand why something is playing out the way it is in the United States and not their home countries. And then the other piece, which I really love, particularly around the time around elections, is to really invite our international students to comment on what they're seeing, particularly with the students in the US, because that's a great education for students when they have that back and forth about how they're being perceived, how we're all being perceived outside of our own country. So there's a real richness to have our international students, but you have to be really strategic and thoughtful about how to get them into these conversations and the way in which we have these conversations as well.
Yeah, I think one area that I think is a little bit underdeveloped that, you know, I think about a lot is we send so many students, US based, but also international students, back abroad for either study abroad. Increasingly more students are having internships and other professional type of experiences overseas. And then of course, for some of our graduate students, you know, the longer term research. And we spend so much time on our campus, you know, imparting our values around free expression, around respect, around gender and other issues of difference, Title IX, disability, that, you know, I think we forget sometimes that students might have expectations that some of the systems of support and infrastructure that they would find on an American campus may simply just not exist at whatever academic center their studies or their research is centered on. And I think that we've done quite a bit of work around the Title IX realm, because of course the university's reach goes abroad to centers that we control, but oftentimes I don't think that extends to some of these other fundamental issues around expression. And I think there's some work to be done there for sure.
We had a student protests when the Hong Kong protests were in high gear a few years ago. And some of our Chinese students from mainland China were really offended by the Hong Kong students. And so we had this conflict between kind of a nationalism and free speech views, and then being, of course, students in the minority on the campus, you know, and all of them together. And they planned an event, it was quite moving, of Asian students and Asian American students, where people would report on their experience of either oppression or anti-Asian racism on campus. Someone wrote it, but someone else read it. And so it allowed for people who wanted to say something, let's say about the mainland China and its authoritarian government, but without putting themselves at risk. They wouldn't be at risk at Wesleyan, but they knew very well that there were other risks elsewhere. And so we got to hear these very moving testimonies, and they were read by someone else in each case. And it was really very interesting, and it created a different kind of dynamic rather than, it's less personal and more, and in some ways more substantive, I think. I was there as a witness. I, pretty much told to not open my mouth, but it was, I was glad to just listen. I learned a lot.
As we go to the final moments, do you have closing thoughts? Again, this is a conversation that we could keep going for 8 hours, but are there closing thoughts on this and that we should be aware of as we move forward?
I think it's fundamental for education at every level to be instilling in students, in our citizens, an understanding about free speech and tolerance and having an open mind, and how that is essential to an effective democracy and how that's endangered in the current world. And I think that universities should take an active role in explaining to students and challenging students along these lines. At the moment, I guess I would say that's more important even than STEM.
I would agree with you, Professor Stone, for sure. How do we make universities, again, a place where people can be wrong, right? Being wrong is at that place of learning, particularly if you're 18 to 22. There's a lot of being wrong that I wouldn't want to be held accountable for from my 18 to 22 year age. Any thoughts on how to do that in the final moments?
I would offer that I'm not sure that the rhetoric of free speech is the best vehicle for doing that. Actually, I do think it may be rescuable from the libertarian jurisprudence victories of the last decades. I don't know, but I do think giving our students an appetite for and practice with intellectual diversity is really important. And even with that, it's a different way of talking about some of the same things we've been talking about, civility, humility. You know, I wouldn't die for my beliefs because I could be wrong. Bertrand Russell's famous, you know, that, but cultivating people the appetite to listen to people whose views are different from your own, and to get to know people whose experiences are different from your own. I think that's another way of approaching the free speech issue, especially for residential campuses, can I think be very compelling for students, because, well, if I'm right, it really is a pleasure, and when they experience it, they'll want to experience more of it.
I would add, again, just going back to my original point about modeling, just modeling what we preach with each other and with our student body is really, really important, because they will do what we do and not just what we say. And I think to the extent that we can actually be much more intentional about modeling, that will help all of us in the end.
Dean Rasmussen?
Yeah, I agree. I think some of the best examples, and to use the cliche, teachable moments we've had are when our faculty or academic centers or departments invite speakers or hold conferences that have some element of controversy, or not everyone is in agreement with the person who's been invited. I think those are amazing opportunities to help not only model for students that this is what we do. We bring people to campus to hear what they have to say, to argue with them in a thoughtful way, in a way that reflects our training as scholars and students and researchers. And it provides such an amazing opportunity for students to, even if they don't like it, even if they fight against it, it's still an incredibly important experience, which I don't think they, frankly, unfortunately, will get that much anywhere else, if not on a college campus. That's one of our special values among many at the moment, in my view.
Particularly in times in our democracy, right, to be that model of the place that does that. And I just want to put a stake in something that has come up in the last few minutes, and that is that piece about, we always talk about free expression, and we talk about the talking part of it, but we don't talk about the listening part of it that goes hand in hand with that. And I think that that's something that often gets lost in our discursive model as well. I really want to thank all of you for being here. This was a really great discussion. And again, there's so much more we could do here. But thank you much for being here. Professor Stone, Dean Rasmussen, Vice President Cruz, Goff Cruz, and President Roth and President Decatur, who had to leave early. I really like this as a model, Michelle, because this sort of modeled some of that give and take, and certainly in a 3D space would have much more of that modeling that would take place. So thank you again. If any of you have questions or thoughts, feel free to follow up with me or with, I would guess, any of our speakers. Have a good day. Thank you all.